Evan, I think I met you 15 years ago, roughly
Yeah,
15 years ago in Beijing,
right.
when you were writing wonderful stuff for the New Yorker, penetrating the sort of obvious headline stuff about China to the sort of deeper sociological, societal changes that were going on beneath. And since you returned to America, you've been doing exactly the same, which is more difficult in a way because you are American. But
Hmm.
you've been approaching it with that sort of um, detached but deep dive, um, sociological, anthropological even mindset that was so illuminating about China. So I've been as avid a reader of you here as I was when you were in China. So it's a great. I also ought to mention not only have I known you for 15 years, but I've recently got to know your dad, your illustrious
Hmm.
dad, Peter Osnos, as well. So I feel fully invested in the Osnos dynasty or dynasty, you say, but not double underline, not the Osnos oligarchy. You're not an oligarchy. Um,
Not yet, Ed. Not yet.
Not
Give us
yet.
time.
Untold wealth is in your future. Um, uh, so we're going to talk about oligarchy. We're going to talk about your wonderful book, The Haves and the Have-Yachts, but also your recent New Yorker essay on the Oligarch-in-Chief, recent-ish New Yorker essay. Both of which are brilliantly titled and incredibly important essay topics. Um, Let me just start though by asking you to define who the oligarch in chief is. And I ask this because I guess in chief is a bit of a giveaway, but we're talking 5 days after the SpaceX IPO,
Hmm.
catapulted Elon Musk to beyond a trillion. I think he's twice the net worth of anybody else. He's more than 100 times the net worth of Donald Trump. Um, and so I know the answer is Trump is the oligarch in chief, but it would be reasonable for some people to be confused as that, well, maybe the essay is about Elon Musk. Define
Yeah.
oligarch in chief.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed. And by the way, it's a total treat to be doing this with you. Thanks for doing it, especially on a sacred evening where England was playing in the World Cup. It's great fun to be joining the Big Tent crowd tonight. So thanks to everybody and for the invitation to join you. I am writing about Donald Trump when I say oligarch in chief, but exactly as you suspected, it is also about a very strange union about these two people. And, it's worth pointing out that, we have never had a moment in the history, 250 years, a not insignificant timeline on which to be having this conversation, when the richest person in the country was also the largest donor to the presidential campaign in 2024. And then, let's remind ourselves, was also in the really historically unique position, something that John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie never dreamed of then getting an office in the White House complex and then, amazingly, a kind of bespoke agency to use for his own purposes. And as we know, the Department of Government Efficiency was essentially the operational arm of his attempt to try to uh, take his ideas of government and put them at work and see what happened, both domestically and around the world. And so it was in some ways, the display that we saw on Inauguration Day in January of 2025, it was almost like one of those, like it could be carved as a frieze that would give us and future generations a way of understanding the country today. Because what you had, of course, was a president, the wealthiest president we've ever had, surrounded by more than a dozen of the world's wealthiest people. And it turns out, of course, not the end of their collaboration. It wasn't necessarily that many of them had helped him get there. It was also, as we now know, a year and a half into it, the beginning of a whole set of, um, shall we say, opportunities. And part of what I think this country is reckoning with right now is the sense that Trump has and this is not a partisan description, he has made the White House an arena for doing business. His family is involved in doing business at the same time that he's in the presidency in a way that previous generations of presidents would have. Let's be clear here. I'm not saying that they didn't necessarily want to, or that they didn't, in some sense, try to, behind the scenes, continue profiting from extraordinary power and privilege, but nobody did it in this heroically flamboyant way in which he is projecting the message to the country, to the rest of the world, that this is the new normal. And I think that that's one of the things that we're struggling with, Ed. I mean, you do it on the page, I'm doing it in my work, is trying to figure out what is temporary here, what is permanent, what is a change that will last beyond this president, and of course, how did we get here at all?
And definitely want to delve into that. Uh, before we get into sort of the bigger picture
Mm,
of today, but also comparisons with the past, with the robber baron age or the Gilded Age, talk to me a little bit about the psychology um, of um, of some of today's super wealthy. I mean, an example I think that you and I shared by email, that you shared with me by email, that of a question that occurs a lot posed to you.
mm,
Well, you're a seriously rich person. You're a cent billionaire at least. Um, and you could be investing in social peace, societal stability, in your collective security as a rich person, um, by not resisting any and all taxes. Instead, though, you're building, and this isn't just Peter Thiel, but you're building a bunker in New Zealand. You're prepping for an escapist sort of dystopian scenario where everybody's trying to kill you. Um, why are you going for that latter option
mm.
and not the former?
The psychology is exactly what drew me to this topic, too, frankly. I'm sure it's what attracts you, too. I think I'll tell you a very revealing comment that I was talking to a former hedge fund manager who said, look, we know the data. Everybody knows the data. There are 25 hedge fund managers in America who make more than all the kindergarten teachers combined. He said, it doesn't feel very good to be one of those 25, which is fascinating because what he was getting at is even though somebody in that cohort has clearly succeeded by the system that we've created, that person is didn't get there by being immune to the signals that society is kicking up. You don't run a successful financial business by being somehow obtuse to what the public mood is or where things are going or what's the level of anxiety versus what's the level of satisfaction. In fact, you probably are pretty good at sussing that out. So to your question then, why does one use their money to protect themselves rather than to try to prevent the very kind of social collapse that they're concerned about? And I will tell you, I'll give you an answer, but before I do, I will tell you there are people who kind of speak out against that tendency to want to build your bolt hole. In the book, I quote Max Levchin, who's a billionaire tech entrepreneur, who says, when this issue comes up at dinner parties, which I thought was quite an interesting way of saying it, I often say, why, if you're so worried about social collapse, how much are you giving to your local homeless shelter? Are you doing something about it? The answer for why people say that they're spending their money on these kinds of, let's call it what it is, self-protection over social, societal protection, is that they believe that they've lost control of the ability to prevent these bad outcomes. This is like a key insight because, in some ways, what they're saying is even though I have immense control over the levers of society, much more than anybody else without those resources, they feel, either true or not, they feel as if it is beyond their grasp. And this gets to a really big underlying theme in the book, which is the feeling that certain things are inevitable, that these are trends beyond our grasp, that no matter how powerful I am, I have no agency to change it. So for instance, we take things like take certain elements of tax law or of the law around finance, and people will say, look, I am doing what the law allows. full stop. And to which the answer is either, well, that's true, it's out of your control, or let's be blunt, this is a set of rules that have been created over time. They've been designed like by hand to make them as advantageous as possible. So then when you're in the position of being able to take advantage of them, it's not as if they happened by immaculate conception. So this idea of what is actually plastic, what is actually controllable and changeable is at the core of what I'm interested, because my argument fundamentally is that there is more that we can change about this phenomenon if we talk about it. The first step to changing it is talking about it, categorizing it, inventorying it, making it vivid, making it clear, and having a public conversation about what do we admire and what do we find not very admirable. Do we want this kind of thing, or do we not want this? Who do we celebrate? And so that's the long answer to your great question about why somebody does what they do.
And the contrast is off, well, increasingly, but also often made between today's super wealthy and the mid to late 19th century super wealthy, the robber barons versus the oligarchs, however you like to
Mm.
characterize it. Um, and the point is often observed that the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, etc., however ill-begotten some of their wealth were pretty philanthropic. You know, they built symphony halls and libraries and so on. Um, and that it's kind of hard if you think about Zuckerberg or even Bezos or certainly Musk. It's kind of hard to think of an equivalent philanthropic or charitable sort of public works that they're giving. Am I missing something? Is it just more subtle? Is it just less bricks and mortar? Or
Mm.
or is the contrast genuinely a valid one to make?
Now, there's a quite a noticeable contrast, and there's some very interesting texture on it. I mean, I think when you look back at the experience that the Rockefellers and the Carnegies represented, there was a point when they, in the beginning, of course, they weren't giving their money away, and then over time, partly because of, in some cases, it was a religious motivation. In other cases, it was a growing sense of public pressure. In others, it was a kind of grand vision of wanting to give back to the country, which, in their view, had given them so much that had made this fortune possible. So you have somebody like, Rockefeller, who gave away 50% of his fortune. I think his son gave away 90% of the rest. Massive philanthropic contributions. Carnegie, of course, gave us public library systems that we have today. And this it set a pattern. And in some ways, you heard this even through into the 1950s and 60s, when you heard somebody like John F. Kennedy, who was, after all, in his own, call him a regional oligarch of the time, that he was, what did he say? He said, to whom much is given, much is expected. And then you saw that carry through in the generation of Warren Buffett, for instance, who, along with Bill Gates, created the Giving Pledge, which was a very important cultural artifact of a certain moment. About 10, 15 years ago, when I was reporting, sort of beginning this research, starting to interview some of these folks, at the time, those were the big dogs, the Buffetts, the Gates, and a lot of people were signing up for the Giving Pledge. And the Giving Pledge was that you would give away the lion's share of your fortune. And this was really instructive to me, because what it showed was that the most important cultural figure in that cohort, that as long as the big names were doing it, other people would follow. And Warren Buffett, of course, has been very philanthropic. Bill Gates has been very philanthropic. And Mark Zuckerberg, interestingly, at one point signed up and created also a foundation that was very much in the image of what the Gates Foundation had been. I did a profile of Zuckerberg in the New Yorker, which is in this book, and he was patterning himself at that time, about 10 years ago, patterning himself very much after Bill Gates. And then you fast forward and you see a real change, that today, who is the dominant figure, obviously, in the tech billionaire, now trillionaire world? It's Elon Musk. And what do we know about Elon Musk's philanthropy? Well, according to the New York Times, it's kind of been fascinating. Musk believes that Musk believes that his greatest gift to humanity, as he says, is being the CEO of Tesla, because in his mind that is an inherently generous act because of what it's doing on behalf of the climate. Critics would say, well, you've helped elect a president who's done tremendous damage to efforts on climate change. But put that aside. What has his philanthropy done? According to the New York Times, they looked into the records and so on, and what they found was that in some years he has given away so little, his foundation has, that it is actually at risk of violating the law for not giving away the minimum. And one of the first gifts that his philanthropy gave, according to the Times, was to a school that happened to be co-located in his own home, actually, in Texas, in which most of the students were his children. And so what's amazing is to watch as Musk has emerged as the sort of key man on the horizon, culturally speaking, you've also seen that a younger generation, and there's data that fleshes this out quite impressively, the younger generation of tech successes, they're not giving away money at the same rate that the previous generation did. They are, in fact, as some of you may have read, they are some of them are actively. Brian Armstrong has given from Coinbase has renounced his participation in the Giving Pledge. Peter Thiel tells people to not join the Giving Pledge. He thinks it's kind of politically. He thinks it's wrong. So there's been a kind of, and this is why I return to this idea of changeability and culture, because what we're seeing is there's a zeitgeist among billionaires just the same way as there's a zeitgeist on your block. And the zeitgeist at the moment is much more about, it's sort of, let's call it the Mark Zuckerberg of 2026 rather than the Mark Zuckerberg of 2015. It is let it all hang out, go to the UFC fight at the White House, as he says, put more manliness into the C-suite. So it's been fascinating. And part of the reason why I wrote this, essentially kind of, Margaret Mead goes to the mega yachts, was just to try to say, let's just capture this moment in time, because it has an enormous impact on all the rest of us here in the United States and around the world. And to quote Bill Gates, this is a rather, a gloomy point, but it's one that's worth acknowledging early on here, is that, one of the effects of Doge, which was to get rid of the USAID and to have a big impact on the scale and effectiveness of foreign aid around the world. To quote Bill Gates, the scene of the world's richest man killing some of the world's poorest children is not a good one. And that's a hell of a thing for him to say. And I think it's one of those moments that causes us to reflect on the impact of this kind of not just economic power, but political power.
And it is the opposite end of the spectrum to that JFK quote you gave, to whom much is given, much is owed. Um, Now, there's a bit of a chicken and an egg thing here with Donald Trump and the oligarchs, whether you call him the oligarch-in-chief or the oligarch-enabler-in-chief, whatever, however your perspective is on Trump. He was an iconoclast and is, um, because he doesn't sort of pretend any kind of social broader empathy with
Mm,
people. And he is, as you say, the richest president ever. And therefore, he's a bit of a permission structure, right? He's a bit of a green light for the Musk feeding the world's poor into the wood chipper, whatever, or USAID into the wood chipper. To what extent has Trump caused this or just revealed it?
mm. Oh, that's been a kind of preoccupying question that has recurred to me so much over the last 11 years now. My own view, frankly, Ed, is that he is very much a symptom of underlying facts. And those facts have to do with essentially, what became permissible. What so much about this conversation is really about what this gruesome word that social scientists use, which is norms. But what do we mean by norms? What we mean is what's normal. What is considered normal behavior? And as we all remember, in those early moments of the 2016 campaign, just one thing after another that Trump did, people said, well, that's just beyond the pale. It's just utterly unacceptable. Whether it was, mocking somebody, John McCain, for being a POW, or fighting with the parents of a Gold Star family. I mean, I'm bringing these things up that are 10 years old because in some ways we all just we let these things wash over us and they just become part of the sediment. But in fact, they are also then part of the sediment that is affecting culture because over time, what happens is it changes the norms of what is acceptable. If somebody had told you 10 years ago, Ed, that there would be a UFC fight on the at the White House to celebrate the 250th anniversary, and that Donald Trump would have essentially that he would have become a financial stakeholder in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. That in all kinds of ways his family would be conducting its crypto businesses with absolutely no regard for the fact that a great number of Americans consider this to be completely ludicrous abuse of the public trust. That one thing after another, then you would say, okay, yeah, that's never going to be possible, but here we are. So I think, it happens to be that my last book, which was called Wildland, which is the story of essentially three places I've lived in this country and how they changed. It was a story, Ed, that as an author, you'll appreciate this, which is I thought, I figured like most people that Trump was going to lose in 2016. And I still wanted to write that book because the whole purpose of the book was to say, how did somebody like that even become possible as a candidate? That's the story we should be writing and understanding. Um,
Now,
so
you mentioned mega yachts just now. I mean, like you could sort of, and you do go through a typology, an escalation of yachts. You've got luxury yachts, super yachts, mega yachts, giga yachts. Um, uh, this is a sort of incredible scale of wealth with multiple helipads and like it's almost sort of liveried servants. Um, is this competition between the super rich? Is this just like, to be very crude, my dick is bigger than yours? I mean, what is sort of driving this arms race in luxury yachts to pick the most conspicuous example, but also in all other kinds, many other kinds of
yeah.
hierarchy of luxury needs?
Well, it happens to be that the, shall we say, psychoanalytic layer of this is not all that disguised in the sense that in the industry, the relevant metric is LOA. This is how boats are measured, which stands for length overall. But actually, it was a conversation that I think perhaps brought me inside the psychology most directly, which is that the guest uh, on a one of the world's most valuable yachts recalled to me a conversation he had with the owner, in which the owner said to his friend, "Look, you and I are both fortunate and successful. You have a chef, I have a chef. You fly private, I fly private." He said, "So the only way that I can signal to the world that I am in a different effing category than you is the boat." And I thought that's that really does get to the heart of it. That in some ways, and this is where we're not that complicated as a species. I've spoken to captains of these super yachts. Who one guy in particular was telling me the story about taking the owner out around the marina. At one point, they were in Italy, and the owner of the yacht had a few $100 million that he'd put into his boat. Nice piece of hardware, as it's known in the business. And as they go around and they're seeing these bigger, more splendid, more extraordinary vessels, finally this guy is in despair and he says, take me back to my boat." And he sort of mutters to himself, "How can I keep up?" And in some ways, that's the subject of this book, Beneath the Surface, is insatiability. That's the word. What is it about? What is it that makes us want more? To quote Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, who is such a great character, he says, "Yes, but I'd trade it all for a bit more." And there's something to that, Ed. I think, in fact, because I mean, I'll give you an example. In the pages of the Financial Times, I learned some years ago the splendid fact. It was a wonderful way of describing it that, a yacht is a terrible investment. One of your colleagues had said at the time, he says, it's like holding 10 Picassos above your head while treading water. And in some ways, that's true. So people do it for very sort of, I would say, primal psychological reasons, even if they may dress it up in kind of grand aesthetic
So
language.
we have a joke at the Financial Times, but chiefly because of the how to spend it section that
Yeah.
comes with the Weekend FT edition that commands super high advertising prices, old-fashioned, old world print advertising, glossy page
Yeah.
for yachts, for homes in Umbria and Tuscany and Martha's Vineyard, etc. That we are a news that the Financial Times is an expensive watch catalog with a newspaper attached. Now, that isn't actually true, but it's a good joke that reveals something. But it also, I just want to underline, uh, I do not feel any sort of deep antipathy towards
Mm.
wealthy people.
Right.
But in American society at large, you're feeling something nowadays that quite sort of unused to as an observer of America, which is a lot of resentment building up, and it expresses itself in different ways. But Bernie Sanders is 84, I think, or maybe still 83, but he's that sort of age. AOC is half a century younger. But they draw crowds of, as you put in your piece, 30, 40,000 in places like Idaho.
Hmm.
Um, Question to you is their approach that takes a slightly broad brush, you're all villains. Is their approach the political way forward here? I mean, what do you see as the best political response to dealing with Gilded Age levels of inequality of wealth and of political power?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, we're at a very interesting kind of moment in American political attitudes where things are changing. So historically, as you say, Americans have actually been quite tolerant of inequality and of large fortunes. It's a part of our, it's a part of our national creed, the idea that maybe I can get there someday. I remember there was a very funny moment in when Jimmy Carter, I think, was running for president, and he'd suggested at some point banning inheritances above a certain point. And even his own staff said, that'll never work. As one of his staff said, that'll never work because every schlub on the street thinks someday I'm going to wake up and my rich uncle's going to leave me a fortune. And in some ways, there is a piece of this. We are divided. In fact, if you look at the data, you find that 58% of Americans will tell you that they believe that billionaires are making the country less fair. And an identical share, 58%, will tell you that they themselves want to be billionaires. That is the American condition. But something is changing, which is that younger Americans, particularly Gen Z, is actually much less optimistic about that possibility, about them becoming um, about them sort of joining that wealthiest cohort. And that's, their intuition is correct. I mean, if you were born in 1940, you stood a 90% chance of out earning your parents. Today in the United States, it's less than half that chance. So they're right about that. And you see it in reflected. It takes people on average now 10 years longer to buy their first house than it did in the 1970s. But to your question, which is what is the right political strategy to meet the American attitude, I actually think that what we find, and this has been really, I go into this a bit in this piece, the Oligarch-in-Chief, that what we find is actually that Americans don't love it if you broad brush demonize the rich. It doesn't really work as a political mobilization strategy because it feels in a way like it throws out all the honorable stories with the ones that people may not feel as honorable. So there's something very interesting going on, which is that we'll call it the Bernie Sanders generation of politics. It's now been 10 years since Sanders kind of began to focus American conversation more clearly around issues of oligarchy. And he has absolutely tapped into something. But there may be a version of that message. And I'm not a political strategist, I'm not providing political advice to anybody. But it is, in fact, there is a version of that message that is more inclusive and encompassing when it says, in effect, look, I want people to succeed. I want to succeed too. And what the Democratic Party, and I've heard some very senior Democrats say this. I've interviewed people about their political messaging, and they say what the Democratic Party needs to do is figure out how to say, we're the party that wants to help you get rich, and we're the party that is here to tell you why you are not, what's standing in your way. But we fundamentally want you to prosper. And because in some ways, what the corruption that we are seeing now provides as a political opportunity, and that's just have to call it what it is. It is corruption on a scale that we never would have tolerated 10 or 20 years ago in this kind of naked form. It provides an opportunity for political messengers to come out and say, you work hard, you pay your taxes, you don't deserve to have it be squirreled or frittered away among friends and family of the powerful elites. That's the message. It's not that complicated. And that's something that I think you can hear Democrats or Republicans use.
Now, I'm going to ask one or two very sort of quick fire questions before
Hmm.
going to audience questions. And sorry to have been selfish and hogged more time maybe than I should have. Um, One of my final two questions is um, what in the course of your research and your writing and your interviews has been the most surprising or even amusing example of really unusual positional good consumption of just odd, conspicuous signs of displays of wealth? What struck you more than anything else?
Well, I'll give you one that is not in the book because I just came upon it recently and I find it immensely interesting and revealing, which is that you now have a situation where the boats have become so large, the yachts have become so enormous, and people can essentially live on them in perpetuity. They're designed to be more or less self-sufficient. You know, you can go to shore now and then and get what you need. But as a result, you now have people who are conducting their business from the yacht almost all the time. But it's created a bit of an awkward situation because the backdrop is often a spectacular tropical beach or something like that, which is weird if you're talking to people in a Zoom and everybody else is under fluorescent lighting, against a kind of hostage video white wall. And so you've had some yachts that have actually added in now a kind of work from home backdrop, just a grim white bit of real estate to simulate life back on land. And so I've decided that may be the ultimate example of now the snake eating its tail, and we've come full circle.
So I'll reserve another question I've got till later because there are too many questions from others.
Hmm.
Um, so from John Cooper, I've been asking this question for more than a decade. Where are we headed as a nation when too much is not enough? Where is America headed on the trend lines
Yeah.
you've just been elucidating?
It's the question. It's a great question. I'll tell you here. This gives me. I'll give you I'll give you the gloomy scenario, and then I'll give you the optimistic scenario. The gloomy scenario, which some people will have already intuited, is that if you want to understand the rise and fall of great powers, talk to a historian of Rome. And one of the things you discover if you read the work of somebody like Ramsay MacMullen, who was one of the great scholars of ancient Rome, he was once asked, how do you sum up the fall of Rome? And he said, well, it took 500 years, but it could be condensed to three words. He said, fewer had more. So that's the unhappy scenario. But here's the good news scenario, because I actually consider this back to our very first point today, the question of what is in our grasp, what is conceivable, where do we have agency? Is it actually within our own history, within the last century and a half? We have steered the ship away, as it were, from collapse, which is that when we were at the end of the 19th century, very similar situation. You had people beginning to give up on democracy. You had feelings of despair. You had kind of, actually, Americans were beginning to live shorter lives. It was a bit like, the deaths of despair we saw in West Virginia and Appalachia. Um, and because of a sustained, committed desire on the part of Americans who cared that through civil society, frankly, through the 19th century version of calls like this, people said, nope, this is not right. This is not sustainable. and this doesn't have to happen this way. And they began to organize, build public pressure, and through the tools of democracy, they were able to bring about exactly the transition that people are thinking about in some cases today, which is how do you go from a Gilded Age to an age of reform? And what it created, remember, we went from the Gilded Age to the most prosperous century, not only in American history, but in global history. There has never been a more successful system than the American system in the 20th century. And that was after the advent of the income tax, after the creation of antitrust law, after the creation of reasonable regulation to try to make sure that there was a balance between new upstart companies and the Goliaths that already existed. So it is a false choice to say we either have to, carry on as we are, or we have to give up innovation. That's nonsense. And anybody who tells you that isn't actually giving you a square deal.
So the fewer had more, and I'm now sort of amalgamating two or three questions about something that occurred in your piece, which is we used to say other countries had oligarchs, America has very rich people, and now we say America has oligarchs. And if you
Mm.
study the alleged paradise for oligarchs, Putin's Russia, they have a pretty short life expectancy. They tend to fall out of windows, drink strangely sort of toxic cups of tea in places like London. That they never actually win. It's the autocrat who
Yeah.
wins. And so the question arises, why are they backing an autocrat when if you study history or contemporary societies elsewhere, it doesn't end well for the people with money.
It's absolutely true. It was a scholar pointed this out to me when I was reporting that piece that they said, the oligarchs who are allying themselves with Trump would be wise to read the recent history here. And the relevant history is that the United States is following a path or has followed a path that is in its way kind of bears some similarities to the Russian example. There's a brilliant scholar at Northwestern named Jeffrey Winters, who gives us some of the language around oligarchy. And one of the things he says is the United States, to some degree, has had a civil oligarchy from the beginning. But what we've moved into, or what we're showing signs of, is what's known as a sultanistic oligarchy. That's what the Russians have. A sultanistic oligarchy is where one figure, the oligarch-in-chief, essentially presides over the others. But as you point out, it is just from an actuarial standpoint, it is not a particularly wise bet to go along with an oligarch in chief.
So Darlene Bookoff says there've been studies about happiness which point to people justifying their wants, a new fancy car, house, spouse, etc., by saying, if only I had, then I'd be happy. And I guess that implicit question is, why isn't Elon Musk happy? Sorry to be blunt, but he doesn't. Peter Thiel goes around talking about the Antichrist. Mark Andreessen thinks everybody's trying to steal from him. Elon Musk is deeply unhappy. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I don't think I need to be to
Yeah.
to spot a very angry person. Um,
Oh, I mean, that is, talk about that being the heart of the matter. I mean, that is exactly one of the things that interests me from the psychological perspective. I think there's two things going on. One, we don't hear from, put it this way, the happy hermit doesn't have a Twitter account, much less does he buy Twitter. That the person who has found serenity and satisfaction rarely is the person who feels the need to desperately go out and announce to everybody how happy and satisfied they are. There's a hole in the heart of a lot of the folks who all of us, look, many of us know people of this type, depending on how many commas they have in their fortune is irrelevant. You can be an unsatisfied, wealthy person at the lower end of today's scale. Because what it's really about is, will anything ultimately satisfy you? And no, I have been struck. And I will tell you, there's one of the reasons to write about this industry of yachts. I chose these machines as symbols for a reason, because the industry has perfected harvesting these, shall we say, voids in people's overall sense of happiness. One of the things that I saw when I went to the launch, I watched a family had bought a super yacht, mega yacht, and the speech that the owner of the company gave on the very day that they got their mega yacht. They poured more than $100 million into this thing. And the owner of the company said, "Congratulations on taking the first step up the big ladder." And I thought, my God, that's impressive that he did that with a straight face.
But you're getting me to the point where the England-Croatia game is no longer an excuse, and I'm just going to sort of drink some. Um,
Take the governor off, I think.
Indeed. Okay, so from Linda Gustitius or Gustitus. I'm sorry, forgive me, Linda, if I mispronounce your last name. What is the most important thing we need to do to reverse this situation?
I think the most important thing you can do, and this is a bit of preaching to the choir, because if you're on this call, you're already at least call it engagement curious, is engage. This is an astonishing fact, is that, I write as much as I write about the very rich, I also write about people who are struggling in this country. And I wrote a lot about West Virginia in my last book. And one of the most amazing statistics was that West Virginia over the last generation has gone from one of the places that had the highest level of voter participation to now one of the lowest levels in the country. And that is, in a way, a proxy for an overall level of disengagement, of people just tuning out. But one of the things we know from history, from the study of oligarchies in countries like the Philippines or Ukraine, for instance, before the current government, or even Hungary under Orban, is that when the public gets engaged and gets organized, that it has a cumulative effect, and it takes multiple forms. So in some cases it's labor strikes, in other cases it's cross-class protests. So, and the third thing is investigative journalism. That these things can help because they begin to turn the cultural tide. I started this conversation talking about the cultural zeitgeist, and I return to that matter because if essentially what you're doing is you're saying I'm going to use my voice, my citizenship to talk about what I think is unacceptable, what I think is a violation of the public trust. You have an effect on the people around you. One of the things that drew my attention earlier this year was that when people say they look at Hungary and they say, what is the lesson perhaps we can draw from Hungary that might apply in the United States? And one of the things is that the corruption under the Orban government became so nakedly visible and easy to understand because at one point a reporter flew a drone across the estate that belonged to Orban's father and found that he had an exotic zoo, including zebras. And so all of a sudden, zebras became the symbol of corruption under Orban. And you had people going to protests wearing zebra costumes. You had zebra memes everywhere. And so, in a way, by talking about things that are concrete, clear, that say to me, this is unacceptable, this is not the country I want, you can begin to make it perhaps more comprehensible, and then people can engage and act.
This is a question about our friend and colleague, Anne Applebaum, and
Mm.
relationship with from Donna Rodzinski. What do you think of the thesis in Anne Applebaum's book, Autocracy, Inc., that autocrats and oligarchs are in effect working together across borders, using kleptocratic financial structures to support one another? And if I could um, sort of add my own tuppence worth there. I mean, we are this week talking about a memorandum of understanding with Iran with the promised $300 billion. We're in
Yeah,
the realm where diplomacy has numbers on it,
yeah,
probably fictional, but where the diplomats are in fact themselves billionaires or cent millionaires at least.
yeah,
We're just in a different time, right?
yeah, yeah. No, it's a look. We're talking about. I mentioned Orban a moment ago, and it is not an incidental fact, for instance, that the MAGA movement, that the Trump phenomenon was stitched up with the Orban phenomenon because they stand for similar ideas, not just ideologically and politically, but also the sense that they are beyond the reach of public censure, that there is nothing. that can stop them. I mentioned earlier this word norms. Well, Hungary was going to be the blueprint for what the United States was supposed to become, a system in which the other institutions of government have been impoverished and degraded and ultimately incapable of checking the behavior of the sovereign. And what we've learned this year, it's incredibly inspiring and vivid evidence. Not easy. I'm not saying you can just replicate this thing. No country is the same as the other, but there is a lesson to take there. So, yeah, there is, I think, a level of international, call it coordination and co-inspiration, and and I frankly, you and I both have friends and colleagues who are doing incredibly hard investigative reporting work to try to clarify these really esoteric financial instruments that serve the benefits of various oligarchs. And that work is often unglamorous, very low, very sort of slow. And then the job is to make sure, and this is where everybody on this call is a sort of amplifier, is to make sure that that gets out there, that people who are not tuned into politics find out, actually, you would be offended if you knew how much money is being secreted away from your hard-earned tax money.
And it's interesting that Peter Magyar, the new leader of Hungary, began very obscure, a couple of years ago, very obscure position as a mid-level civil servant, picking up on an issue of corruption, of covering up of an abuse scandal in a children's home, a
Correct.
specific corruption
Yeah.
that everybody can relate to. Let me pose a question from Susan Duffield, who's interested in an earlier question about the concentration of the technology in the oligarchic sphere. Does that make this time different? And I guess, we've been focusing on the robber baron or the Gilded Age, but we're in the early stages of AI.
Yeah.
And so maybe what we're talking about now um, is in its infancy rather than in its maturity.
Very much so. I mean, I think it's worth actually drawing out too, just to clarify the contrast, the interesting comparison between the earlier oligarchs and today and their use of what was the technology of the time. I mean, I've had sometimes people say to me, well, what's the difference between Trump or between, Musk owning Twitter, now X, and William Randolph Hearst owning newspapers, and isn't that just the sort of the inkwell of its day now? The difference is, and this is where it gets so interesting, is that absolutely different. They're absolutely different because the difference between having a newspaper on which you can print your opinions is like having a Twitter account. But when you own a network that allows you to tweak the dials of what people see and how one idea leads to another, and which things are silenced and which things are made normal. There's that word again, which things are made normal. That gives you a tremendous technological power over what people see and hear and believe. And so that is a compounding advantage in which your idea, you mentioned earlier some of the people, for instance, like Peter Thiel or Mark Andreessen, who have esoteric political views, by which I mean their views are statistically clearly out of the mainstream. They are not normal. They're not where most Americans are. And yet, because of the power that they have at their disposal, they're able to amplify their views both through media platforms, but then also by buying political access, by being able to ensure that their chosen candidates get success and so on. And then pitching it forward, I happen to be writing at the moment a long piece that gets very much to the question of AI and the shape of the future. And we're absolutely at the beginning of what could be the biggest explosion of inequality that we have ever seen. I mean, there are, and I know this for a fact, there are CEOs in Silicon Valley who have a kind of private running conversation, call it a bet, about which will be the first company that has $1 billion valuation and one employee, meaning just a single person, because that's the natural end result of these kinds of dynamics.
And there is a question, so just here it is from Hilary Standish that sort of keys into that, which is what's the supposed tipping point for peaceful protests making a difference is 3.5% of the population. It's really, really hard to get 3.5% of the population. Um, Majorities don't make history, tiny minorities do.
Agreed.
But I suppose my add-on to that question, a very good question from Hilary Standish, is what's your hunch? I mean, you've been,
Yeah,
really absorbed in this material. You've viewed America from the outside and the inside, and you've been
yeah,
working on this for a long time. You could paint a sort of fork in the road where
mm,
one fork leads to the Hunger Games
yeah,
and another leads to FDR. I mean,
yeah.
two such radically different scenarios. They belong in parallel universes, but you can make either of those cases with equal plausibility today. What feel do you get? What's
Yeah.
in your bones?
Great question. I will be honest with you, Ed. I am no Pollyanna, but I also deeply believe that we are approaching a point when people say enough is enough. And what we see throughout American history is that our democratic equipment, small d democratic equipment, that this system, as flawed and degraded as it is, has the extraordinary capacity to allow us to do a do-over every 2 years or every 4 years. And one of the things you see is that the pendulum swings, but sometimes you have to push the pendulum. This is the absolutely blaring lesson of American history, is that there are times when at a certain point people say, I cannot bear this anymore. And at that point they say, I'm finding somebody who will meet my needs. And I say this having lived in a lot of countries where people don't have that possibility, don't have the ability to take the moment. And so that actually fills me with energy rather than with despair. And it is a truly honest and deeply felt view.
Um, I mean, we've got 2 or 3 minutes left, and actually, I've just had a correction to Hunger Games. The better phrase is French Revolution, but I think it means something different, actually. I think Hunger Games is a continuity of this, except
Mm.
for the last one, and I forget. Well, it's not the mocking, but anyway, I don't want to embarrass myself. Um, but let me ask you a last question. I
Mm.
mean, we began with Trump, and we haven't. I think it's a good thing, allow this conversation to be dominated by Trump.
Yeah,
But if you look at the world we live in today, day to day, all day, every day, his ability to command the attention economy, which is
yeah.
such a huge and growing part of the economy, if you look at that, but also at what we've been discussing, take a guess, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, what will be more important? Will it be Trump's presidency or will it be the rise of the American oligarchy?
Well, I think the rise of the American oligarchy is a transformation of what it means to be American, because it baked into our idea of ourselves is this sense that sure, we will have always a gap between some people who are rich and some people who are poor. But the core American self-narrative is that we have never had royalty. We've never had dynastic wealth in which people are passing on fortunes so large that there's no way to ever get on the other side of that canyon if you've been born on the wrong side. And that is the more fundamental issue that I think will be reflected in the grand contours of our history. Trump is both, as we've talked about, he's a symptom of it. He is also very much an accelerant on the fire. But he never would have happened were these forces not in play. I would, I'll bring us back to a tweet that Elon Musk said, which I think future historians will be looking at, which is Elon Musk writing on his own social media platform said, "Were it not for me, Donald Trump wouldn't be president." And the Democrats would control the House of Representatives. And then the amazing line from my perspective is what he said afterwards, which was, how ungrateful. So in a way, he was saying this is like a defective product. And so that's the point where Americans on some deep level are just saying, nope, enough is enough. And what I'm scanning the horizon for, and I suspect you are too, Ed, you and I both are kind of always looking to see what's around the bend in American political culture, is who is going to be the generation or the individual in politics who figures out how to take some of these issues and makes them specific, concrete, and legible for people. And they'll rally behind him or her.
Well, thank you so much for a
Thanks, Ed.
fascinating, sort of highly fertile series of thoughts and hopefully lots of seeds planted. And thank you. It was an honor to
Great
do.
pleasure to be with you. Thanks.